how you act, how you conduct yourself. It can be linguistic.
Yeah.
If you speak different languages, if you have maybe a certain dialect or a certain accent perhaps. It can also be sartorial, so how you dress, what kind of clothes you wear. What about religion? He kind of touches on that. He talks about the hijab a little bit, but religion is kind of, and this kind of gets right to the crux of Islamophobia as racialization, as race, Islam as race. So how does religion play a role here, right? So a scholar named Liron Medavoy, I might be totally butchering his name, I apologize, he has identified this concept called dogma line racism, which is a really interesting concept. And he identifies dogma line racism as this second axis of race. So with the first axis being color line, so this more traditional phenotypical,
what we commonly associate with.
Right,
Yeah.
something more phenotypical in skin color. But he underscores this notion of a dogma line racism, which is interesting. And what does he mean by this? So he kind of identifies the color line, and then with that groundwork, identifies how dogma line differentiates. So he identifies color line racism as a racism of the body, of a superiority and an inferiority, and citing another scholar, as a spectrum of humanity to animality, right? By contrast, he identifies dogma line racism as a racism of the soul, of this friend versus enemy, kind of going back to philosopher Carl Schmitt. This friend versus enemy, and always through a lens of warfare. Again, so a lens of threat, militarized kind of threat. And for our purposes, he talks about this issue of or this common use of the phrase Arab and or Muslim.
Yeah.
And I don't want to get into it too much, because I think it's really interesting to kind of let that sit in your mind and just understand what's happening there. So I'll leave it at that, but this is part of what's happening. What do we mean by Arab and or Muslim? So what's happening there? So I'll leave it at that, and then we'll just keep talking. So he mentions how today, jumping forward in this kind of post-war on terror, well, not post, but this never seemingly ending war on terror time that we're in, that what we're seeing is a racial targeting of the unmarked body. So and of this this kind of need to discern target populations, with the presumption being that some of the target populations you might not be able to really discern who they are.
Yeah.
So if a body is unmarked, how is a body unmarked? So it's a mode of racialization that is non-corporeal, and is presupposing a difference, not based on skin color, but on mental or psychopolitical life. So kind of a racism, again, of the soul. So the author just goes on to say that this kind of phenomenon is operationalizing religion as race, and it's functioning, of course, alongside color as race. So again, color line, just to kind of emphasize, because this is kind of a little bit theoretical. So again, just to underscore what's happening here, color line racism marking superiority, inferiority, dogma line racism marking one's potential for heresy and for perpetual enemy, being a perpetual enemy. And this author does a really interesting thing. He tries to trace a genealogy of dogma line racism, and he identifies 4 important points in global history of when this has happened. But I think the most important one for the purposes of our discussion here today is what happened in 15th century in the Iberian Peninsula. So I know we have to go back to 1492 to understand what's happening today. It might seem kind of weird, but it's actually it's illuminating. So, and by Iberian Peninsula, we're referring to Spain and Portugal. Well, we know today Spain and Portugal, but of course then as well. So, in terms of the 15th century, we can zero in on 1492, the year 1492, which many of us remember as the year that Christopher Columbus set sail to discover what he thought were the East Indies. He ended up a little bit somewhere else.
The New World.
Right, the New World to discover. A lot of bunny ears. 1492 is also, in addition, it is also the year when the Spanish crown conquered Moorish Spain and expelled Muslims and Jews. So that was a big year. Now, some of the Muslims and Jews who remained, those who remained were ordered by decree to convert to Christianity, to Catholicism, or to leave. Some left, some stayed. And of those who stayed, some converted. The intention perhaps is a little bit less clear. Maybe it was authentic. I'm sure for some it were. But for some it was also very strategic. You know, it was a way to avoid expulsion and discrimination, to convert.
Or even death.
Yes, exactly. And despite the intentions of some of these Muslims and Jews who remained, converts to Catholicism were still perceived as other. They were never fully welcomed into the Catholic Spanish fabric then. So as a result of this, there were two institutions in Catholic Spain that were utilized to detect if Christians, these new Christians, had Muslim or Jewish bloodlines. So they wanted to see, okay, you say you're Christian, but are you
really Christian?
Yeah, do you carry a Muslim bloodline or a Jewish bloodline?
Yeah.
Which what does it mean? How
do you decipher that? How do you is there a different DNA, you know?
Yeah. How does religion run through your veins? It's very strange and very very chilling when you think about it. So the Spanish Inquisition at that time detained, tortured, and sought to extract confessions from so-called crypto-Muslims and Jews. Again, that should sound familiar in terms of what happened in the immediate wake of 9/11. It's kind of, you detain and you torture and you try to extract confessions, right? So in addition to the Spanish Inquisition, the Crown had implemented these statutes called limpieza de sangre, which is Spanish for blood purity. So it meant that anyone who wanted a position of public or ecclesiastical authority had to request that the Inquisition document their pure Christian ancestry and bloodline. They had to be pure Christian, which is again a very kind of a foreign concept, but is it really that foreign to how we understand it today?
Yeah.
So I have a few more notes here about what dogma line is, but I think I'll jump ahead. And again, if you want to learn more about this is a really good article by Libram Medovoy, and I can post a link to it later. It's really, really interesting. So again, why have I jumped back to the 1400s to describe Islamophobia today? So I do this because this paradigm of race as religion functioning alongside race as color effectively became the ideology of empire and of colonization during this age that we call this age of discovery. So this time when these European proto-nation states were sailing and navigating away from Europe to discover new lands, new peoples, new resources, right? The age of discovery. This is of course the time when the United States, the land of what we now call America was being discovered.
Yeah.
And of course the whole continent by European proto-nation states. And so in other words, this paradigm became the frame through which not only Spain but other imperial powers began to see, understand, and classify the other. Going back to Spain really quick, this way that there was more the traditional notions of race at the time, but based on skin color. But adding this religion into the mix and then actually codifying it into law was a really kind of defining watershed moment. And that kind of corpus of law informed other imperial powers of the time, and it served as a useful tool for colonizing and for othering peoples who were encountered and colonized in this age of discovery.
You could even argue that it goes into U.S. immigration law.
Yes,
it's highly racialized.
Sure. Yeah. That's something that I will at least perhaps offer as a parallel. These two phenomena. So, okay, let's see. So where does that leave us for today? In a time when many promulgate narratives of these clashing civilizations, of the West at odds with Islam, of the seemingly unending war on terror, what we are seeing is another period of race making, of one that reflects its 15th century Iberian precursors, of one that collapses race as color and race as religion into our understanding of the enemy threat. People who look Muslim are targeted, both by state policies and by ordinary citizens. Again, by the state and by non-state actors. So this is why perhaps we are seeing upticks in violence and murders against Indian nationals, many of whom, at least in the most recent weeks, were holders of H-1B visas.
The ones in, I think it was Kansas. There were 2 men, one who actually was killed, the other was injured. And the guy who shot them said Middle Eastern men, identified them as Middle Eastern, told them to go back to Iran or something. So he racialized them, assuming them to be Middle Eastern, and then I'm assuming, meaning they're Muslim.
Muslim, yeah. Exactly. And we've also seen, of course, Sikh men wearing dastars or turbans, racialized as Muslim and attacked. One of
the first person who was killed right after 9/11, a few days after, was a Sikh gas station owner, I believe, and he was murdered, perceived to be, I think the killer said, he thought he had attacked the enemy.
Right.
Or what he perceived.
Right.
Who he perceived to be the enemy.
Right.
And he didn't even correctly identify.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one other example as well is, an olive complexioned professor who was on a plane writing out a differential equation. He happened to be Italian, but it's anyway. So, it's why we're seeing Muslims really stereotyped and stigmatized as embodiments of this violence and this potentiality of threat and violence, and of upholding values that are incompatible with the U.S. Constitution, or more vaguely, a little bit less coded American values, and as seeking to subvert Western freedoms from within. It's why Muslim women who wear hijab are perceived as both foreign and oppressed, and also potentially violent and threatening. Yeah. And why incidents of mass casualty are labeled terrorism for some, lone wolf for others. So just to give you kind of a blueprint of what we're seeing and trying to tie it back into what's the theoretical unpacking of racialization. So I really quickly wanted to read an example of an individual in England in the 1700s. He was a Muslim Turk, and he ended up being baptized. And I wanted to read a passage from an actual account of that process of baptism, which was not just a religious process, but it also became a racial national origin process. Not only did he need to be baptized into Christianity, but he needed to be anglicized. And I wanted to share that example just to remind us what was happening in England at that time, because at that time in the 1700s, the U.S., as we understand it now, there was a lot of overlap in terms of culture, in terms of law, in terms of just, collective sentiments, if you will. So kind of these shared values. So let me find a passage here. So yeah, this is an account of a Muslim Turk in 1797, a Muslim convert to Christianity in England. So I'll read you this excerpt. I think it's really helpful, and it helps to elucidate a lot of this racializing. So his name was Bashaw. The baptism of Bashaw entailed the same cultural and personal changes that were required in the baptism of Indians or Native Americans. So again, this interesting modes of encounter and of the way that Native Americans were kind of transplanted onto what Muslims are perceived to be, and what Muslims are perceived to be transplanted onto what Native Americans were perceived to be. So the author goes on, just as Pocahontas had to become English in her apparel, habits, and looks, so did Bashaw. He was told that he could not be baptized with his whiskers. So the bishop conducting the baptism turned barber and clipped them. He then removed Bashaw's Turkish clothing and bought him new ones. Now Ishmael, his first name, the bishop said, you look like an Englishman and a Christian. He then gave him the English name James, just as Pocahontas had been given an English name. To become a Christian was to become English in looks, name, clothing, and religious belief. Unfortunately, Bashaw's becoming English did not lead either to reliable work or to a home. With his English wife by his side, he continued to wander from city to city, having and burying children as they went along, so frequently that he had to sell his story in order to sustain himself, his wife, and their single surviving child out of 10. Neither conversion nor Anglicization could affect his integration into the Christian society of England or Scotland. Bashaw was an other, defeated, impoverished, and alterized. He was in the same situation as the straggling American Indians who entered New England towns, sometimes to be beaten, sometimes pitied, and always to be viewed as outsiders. Yeah, it's very, very powerful. So I wanted to jump to another interesting article by a scholar named Junaid Rana, who had a really important piece, an important article called "The Story of Islamophobia." And just so in his piece, I wanted to kind of extract the way in which Muslims in this country were racialized in a sense that doesn't look the way it does now. So, for example, by way of but what I mean to say is that Muslims in this country have been here before this country was a country, and I think a lot of people forget about that. You know, not only on some of the ships of the early explorers were Muslims, or at least maybe converts, but also those were forcibly enslaved and migrated West Africans were brought to this country, and many of them were Muslim.
I think the estimate is around a third were Muslim.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting because at that time, the slave owners, they differentiated slaves based on, differentiated slaves. So those who were actually Muslim, there's actually stories that Muslim slaves were differentiated and racialized as being overly tanned and as being Moors, which is really interesting. So maybe perhaps this gets into like what that initial author was saying about positive modes of racialization, but again, of course, understanding what's it's
still along that spectrum.
Yes, exactly.
You know.
So I think it's really interesting to keep in mind that Muslim slaves are differentiated from non-Muslim slaves as being overly tanned and as Moorish. And of course, to remember that many enslaved Muslims were literate, and there was a twofold effect of this. They were perceived as a threat because slave owners systematically did not want the human beings that they enslaved to be literate, because they would, it comes with power, and it comes with with privilege and with knowledge.
And I think there's also stories. Oftentimes, some of the slave owners themselves weren't literate. So
yeah.
Again, the power structure.
Exactly. But not only, in addition to that, as a danger, they were also used as a potential for. They also made them more beneficial, perhaps, to the kind of hierarchy of the plantation life. So enslaved Muslims who were literate for a lot of the times, they were given better positions on the plantation, so perhaps working in the house, or perhaps even given, being able to be out in the fields and to be the one who is calling the shots. So they're given actual kind of sometimes authority positions.
Creating a hierarchy.
Exactly, a hierarchy. So there's that history. And then really briefly, so I think we're running out of time here, this notion of Muslim Africans as Moors also carried on into the 20th century. And it became a way for black Muslims to try to displace these constructions of biological race as black versus white by being Moorish, which is very interesting. So you actually had this individual named Noble Drew Ali, and he started a movement of the Moorish Science Temple, and they claimed to be of Moorish ancestry. They produced Moorish American or Moroccan American ID cards to try to supplant this white versus black divide, and also to be able to be afforded legal rights and privileges that them being black otherwise did not afford.
Yeah.
There's some instances of around the civil rights movement or just before it, of some black Muslim jazz musicians who would go into a shop to eat a sandwich or something, and saying, and the shop owner, this is, I would presume, the South based on the story, would say, "We don't serve you," and he said, "I'm Muslim," and he would say, "My name is this," and they were very confused, like, okay, So in a strange way, you know, sometimes being Muslim also afforded it afforded a differentiation and a different way of racializing your identity and the privileges you were afforded. So there's a few other instances in which black Muslim communities tried to, really used different racial constructions of religion and culture to subvert these seemingly, biological determined modes of race and the rights or lack of rights that they were dealt because of that. So you have Nation of Islam as a big example of that, and Moorish Science Temple, of course. And that's another conversation for another time, but just to kind of keep in the back of your mind, especially for today, because when we think of Muslims today, we typically don't think of an Elijah Muhammad, of a Malcolm X,
or Dean Muhammad.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's often that it's a foreign, it's immigrant,
yes,
it's supplanted from the outside.
Exactly.
Whereas in actuality, Islam's been here. Muslims have been here since, as you mentioned, before the founding of this country.
Exactly.
So yeah, knowing the roots and the history, I think, is very, very important.
Exactly.
It's not foreign.
Right.
But it's often perceived to be foreign. The image I think of often when we say Muslim is either Arab or South Asian. It's very rarely that someone will think African American.
Right. When
in reality, African American Muslims make up a quarter, I believe, of the Muslim population in this country. So I think that's very, very important to recognize.
Definitely. And it also underscores how kind of the intransience of how we racialize, and the fact that it's so fluctuating.
Yeah.
There's nothing is set in stone. There's always geopolitical considerations that will change the outcome. I think a big part of that, the why that it is so subject to fluctuation, is that from the founding of our country, which gets back to Spain in the 15th century, is that from the founding of our country in the United States in 1790, Congress passed a law that restricted naturalization to white persons. 1790. So you could only be naturalized or be afforded citizenship if you could prove a racial prerequisite of whiteness.
Whatever that may be.
And that's the issue. We don't know what that means. And so they just kind of, in a lot of legal court systems, they would try to determine, on an ad hoc basis, if you were white or not. And that changed. It completely changed based on, for the most part, geopolitical considerations, but also there was a time where scientific racism was really prevalent, so scientific racism was a big determination of that. But it's so subject to, it's a very subjective process, and it's been in our country since its founding. And it's also not a new thing, because, you look at what happened in Spain in 1492, and it'd be really interesting to look at other countries too, and how they have or have not done this. So I think a really good place to end would be with an example of two court cases in which the applicants had petitioned for naturalization in the early 1940s. And both of them were Muslim, both of them were Arab, and the ways in which the court determined one to be eligible for naturalization and one not eligible for naturalization, and both had to try to prove their whiteness to be eligible. And I think it gives a really good example of what we've just been talking about how this is it's changing. It's not tied to anything, because whiteness is arbitrary. Whiteness is a construct. It's nothing scientific. So I wanted to really quickly read from This American Life, a passage by Mustafa Bayoumi, who's great.
Who will be here at Georgetown next week. So we're really excited for that.
Yes, next Tuesday, so 6 to 7:30. So I'll just really quickly read the passage, and then we'll end there. I think we're...
and be sure to tweet us questions if you have any. We'll definitely be taking them afterwards.
So for the first case was in 1942, and it was a petition by a man named Hassan, and he was Muslim, he is Arab, and he petitioned for naturalization, and the judge at the time denied his petition. And the reason he denied it was the following. So what the judge said: apart from the dark skin of the Arabs, it is well known that they are a part of the Mohammedan world, and that a wide gulf separates their culture from that of the predominantly Christian peoples of Europe. it cannot be expected that as a class they would readily intermarry with our population and be assimilated into our civilization. So in this case, religion totally determined race.
And we want to point out Mohammedan is the word
Yeah.
that's often used historically to mean Muslims. So.
Exactly. And what's so interesting is that, so this was seemingly a pretty clear-cut, slam-dunk case in terms of how the judge explicitly explained his reasoning for this. Only 17 months later, just over almost a year and a half later, another applicant petitioned for naturalization, really similar background. He was Muslim, he was Arab as well, and his name was Mohiez. He petitioned for naturalization, and it was accepted. It was awarded, it's bizarre because what happened in those 17 months that made Hassan not white and Mohiez white?
From 1944 to 1945.
1942, 1944.
Okay.
Yeah. So I just want to briefly read what the judge had said there, and then we can take some questions. So let's see. Did I flag down the right? Anyway, I can't find the passage. No, this is something else here. But anyway, so basically, let me see, is this it here? Oh, yes, this is here. So in 1944, for Mohiez's case, after citing Hassan, the one I just read to you in 1942, the judge stated his position that the Arab passes muster as a white person.
What does that mean?
And the judge ended his decision by admitting that the vital interests of the United States as a world power required granting Mohiez's position. Why? The judge explained that his decision was necessary to promote, this is a direct quote, to promote friendlier relations between the United States and other nations, and so as to fulfill the promise that we shall treat all men as created equal. Of course, World War II was happening at the time, and the only other country in the world that was doing this kind of racialized, exclusionary immigration laws was Nazi Germany. So that was a major geopolitical consideration. So I think it's a good place to end, and there's so much more that can be talked about with this topic, racialization of Islam and Muslim and how it relates to Islamophobia. And yes, and we have 2 questions, so let's take those.
So first we want to hear your reactions to the Pepsi commercial, and then second, your reactions to the TV show Quantico's deal with how they dealt with the Muslim registry topic. Was it Muslim ban or Muslim registry? Registry topic. So you could both kind of give your reactions to those, and maybe there's some overlap with the question of racialization too.
You want to take Pepsi?
Yeah, I'll give my views on Pepsi. So for those of you who haven't seen, but I'm pretty sure everyone's seen it, it went viral and the responses went viral, which caused a lot of debate and a great reaction, I think, from the public of this is really problematic. So it was a Pepsi ad, which seemed to be kind of co-opting a lot of what we in response to, a lot of issues, a lot of police brutality, global income inequality, climate change, all of these issues that people are expressing, their frustrations that our government and our states are not adequately responding to, or they are inherently violating people's rights. So it kind of marketed that, used that as a marketing strategy. Kendall Jenner was their main character. What I found really, really interesting, I guess you could say, is when she takes off her blonde wig, also gives her blonde wig to an African-American woman. Also very problematic. In the protest, there's very, different people. There's a girl wearing hijab who ends up kind of like getting down on the floor and like smiling and taking Kendall's picture. I think all of it was problematic in that it co-ops a struggle of the marginalized, of people who are being affected by state policy and who use, protest as a way to express their frustrations and as a way to build solidarity, and it's using that to sell a product, a sugary product, So I think the most problematic moment for me was Kendall Jenner going up to policemen who, by the way, never look like that at protests. They're in full, riot gear. They are not just there standing with just a hat. They're usually in full riot gear. And she approaches them with a Pepsi can, and he grabs it and drinks it, and whoo, we have world peace, yay! Wonderful. Apparently, I guess that's all we needed to stop, the killing of black men. And I found that even that imagery they used was a co-optation, a utilization of that beautiful image that we saw of a young black woman. Was in St. Louis? No, I really can't remember.
Might have been Ferguson.
Ferguson,
yeah.
I think. I can't remember her name right now. It was a very powerful picture. She's a teacher, I'm pretty sure. And she's standing just very peacefully, just standing, and there's 4 or 5 men, policemen in riot gear just like attacking her, and looks like they're attacking her, and it's a perfect picture of what this, movement is about, a very peaceful, non-violent movement to raise this problem of police brutality, of, mass inequality in this country. And Pepsi using that imagery with Kendall Jenner giving a Pepsi just felt very, very wrong. And I was glad to see Pepsi, take away Pepsi to take the ad down in response. I think it'd be really interesting to see who was on Pepsi's marketing at the time, or who wasn't on it, because just watching the entire, I think from the beginning I was very uncomfortable with where it was going, and I was like, oh gosh, where is this going? And I'm just wondering, did no one tell them, or did they not care?
Yeah.
So that was my response.
2 quick thoughts. One was that, Kendall Jenner was really described as kind of a white person trying to quell racial strife through a Pepsi can, and that is true. But it's also it's interesting because Kendall Jenner is Armenian. Yes. And
well, no, is she? She's not Armenian.
No, she's part of the family.
Their dad was Armenian, so now I'm gonna get into Kardashians. Kendall Jenner, the mom, Kris Jenner, I'm not sure what her is, but it's the dad that the Kardashians get there, and her father's now Caitlyn Jenner. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll hold that thought. Kardashian drama to be continued, perhaps. Anyway, so I'll skip that comment. But the other aspect of the woman wearing hijab in that commercial is that I've seen, and I think a lot of people have seen, this use of Muslim women wearing hijab used in advertising.
Yes.
A lot lately. Almost, I don't want to, a lot lately. And the cynical part of me, and what a lot of others have cited, is that, are you just putting a Muslim woman in hijab in your commercial because it's going to get more clicks and more engagement? Because it can be a little bit controversial for some to see that. And are you going to have more engagement? And is your brand going to, kind of be more profitable? Is it clickbaity? Exactly. Amani Al-Khatatbe, a Muslim girl, she had a really interesting article in Forbes, which I would encourage everyone to read, about how if you're gonna profit off of Muslim women now, will you stand with us later?
Yes. So
really quickly, just to segue to this whole the drama or the hype over this, the Nike line of pro hijab Athletica gear coming down in a few years. There's some people are really happy because it's a sense of, I'm being represented, and I can see myself in this very mainstream way, and not only in through the gear and the apparel, but also in the commercials. Mm-hmm. That's all well and good. That's great. But again, since a lot of Muslim women wearing hijab aren't allowed to compete in professional sports because of their headgear, is Nike going to do anything?
Yeah.
Because they're in a really unique position to do something because of their, they are
their brand.
It's their brand, their sports, exactly. Yeah. And kind of wouldn't make sense if they're designing a brand for Muslim women who wear hijab if they can't even compete professionally.
Yeah.
So I just would kind of problematize that. You know, again, we're seeing another instance of this Muslim woman in hijab. What role is she serving? Is she being instrumentalized as a Muslim woman for clickbait purposes? Oh, and the other question was about Quantico. So I watched the first season of Quantico for professional purposes. I haven't, this is the third season now, I believe. I haven't watched the third season yet, but there was some hype over one of the recent episodes in which they were really talking about a Muslim registration. And most of the agents, some of the agents were really against it and were like, this is against what we stand for, and that's great. And there was, you know, there were some other shining examples of that in the first season that I had watched. You know, one that really struck out to me was, you know, there's twin agents. They're both Muslim. One more so culturally so. She doesn't wear hijab. She doesn't really practice. One who is practicing Muslim. She wears hijab. They're both agents, and they're identical twins. And there's a scene where the agent who wears the hijab was flagged for additional screening, whereas her twin sister, who does not wear the hijab and is not religious, was not. And so all the agents were kind of debriefing over whether she should be admitted into the academy. Quantico being the academy for like where agents are trained and are tested. So they're you know, the other agents are debriefing about whether she should be admitted into the academy or whether she's like kind of a risk. You know why. And you know, her sister really stands by her sister who's being flagged and says, you know, do you have any idea, and they're Arab, by the way, do you have any idea what it was like to be Arab after 9/11? Do you have any idea how we were treated and how, you know, people looked at us and like you know, all the suffering that we faced? Like, do you have any idea what we're going through? Are we doing this again? Who are we? What are we about? So that was a really interesting conversation that they had in this television series. However, that being said, in my estimation, the whole series paints a really rosy picture of the
whitewashes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Really rosy picture of the FBI. I mean, you know, it's talking about how they have these Muslim agents and blah blah blah, and we're hearing about FBI agents. There's at least one who was recently covered who was pushed out of the FBI.
Yeah.
And there's kind of this culture of suspicion of Muslims that's been well documented. So it's great, and you might have these shining moments of navel gazing, but at the end of the day, is it really an accurate representation? And I would say it is not. That being said, I appreciate, especially understanding the audience, probably the projected audience of that show. It's good that they have this conversation so they can see these conversations and think about it, but it reinforces a rosy picture that the FBI is not. Those are my 2 cents.
Do we have any more? All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I know that this was, I think, a very, very important conversation. I think racialization is very important to understand, and I think we often hear the word being thrown around without really understanding what it means and how to identify it. So I hope this helped everyone. Kristen will also be putting up some of the articles that she mentioned on our Twitter, so be sure to follow us at Bridge.Initiative. And next week, Nazir will be talking about his research. It's really, really interesting. We'll be talking about fake stories and where they originate and where Islamophobic stories come from on the internet. So I think it'll be very, very interesting for those of you who will join us. So have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Salon. It's our blooper reel.
Are we done?
After this news network.